Morning, folks, and welcome to today's episode called Carlos Slim, the numbers genius who built an empire. This is a guy whose father fled Lebanon with almost nothing, and today Slim is worth $120 billion. I examine how he built his fortune buying up distressed businesses during Mexico's economic collapse of the 1980s, and how a controversial privatization deal for the national phone company turned him into the richest man in the world. I also look at the huge criticism he's faced for monopolistic practices that cost ordinary Mexicans billions of dollars and also held back the development of an entire country. And also how he's used his fortune combined with this intrinsic, almost intangible gift for numbers to make some very, very savvy investments in everything from Apple to the New York Times. This is a cracking story. Enjoy. Carlos Slim was born on January 28, 1940 in Mexico City. His father had fled Lebanon to escape Ottoman military conscription, and he'd built a pretty significant retail and real estate business worth at least $20 million in today's money. And Slim's father made each of his children keep an exact weekly ledger of what they earned and spent. And Slim just seemed to have a natural ability for numbers and trading. By the time he was 12, he was buying bank shares and making good money from it. But then, in 1953, his father died suddenly of a heart attack at age 65. Slim, who idolised his father, was 13 and was devastated, and said that after his father's death, he didn't go out to play with his friends for 2 years. Now, he went to college to study civil engineering, and he was so good at maths that while still a student, he was asked to teach his fellow students a subject called linear programming. Now, this is basically a type of maths that's for figuring out how to get the most output from any set of resources. And that way of thinking, where's the waste? Where's the hidden capacity? How do I squeeze every last drop of value out of this? This was used by Slim to analyse every single business he ever bought or invested in throughout his life, because he's always been a numbers guy. Journalists who spent time with him describe the same scene every time. Reams and reams of accounts spread across his desk and Slim going through them with a highlighter. As Slim said, the numbers, they talk to me. After graduating, he did work briefly as an engineer, but he realised he could make way more money by playing the markets. And that's what he did, working 14 hours a day. And by 1966, when he was just 26 years old, he'd built up a $40 million fortune. And now he started to put that money to work. First in real estate, and then over the next 15 years, buying and building loads of different types of businesses. There was a regional bottling company, equipment leasing, mining, printing company. But his most profitable and cash-rich business at this stage was Cigatam. This was Mexico's distributor and manufacturer of Marlboro cigarettes. Also, on a side note, he got married in 1967 and would go on to have 6 children, although his wife passed away in 1999 from kidney failure. Now, because Slim had built his business on cash-rich consumer companies and always without borrowing, he had a war chest, and so he was perfectly positioned to take advantage of Mexico's worst financial crisis in its history. So for context, in 1981, the US increased interest rates to 21% because they were trying to kill inflation, which at that time in the US was running at 13%. And it worked. Inflation came down. But here's the problem for Mexico. The country had spent the 70s borrowing heavily in dollars because the country was riding an oil boom. Now these debts were suddenly far more expensive to service. Then the oil prices collapsed. So you've got soaring debt costs and collapsing revenue at the same time. A perfect storm. And Mexico basically couldn't pay what it owed. So the government panicked. It nationalised the banks, trying to stop wealthy Mexicans and foreign investors from taking their money out of the country. But the knock-on impact of this was that multinationals with factories in Mexico, they were terrified that their factories might be nationalised next. So they wanted out. and they were willing to sell at any cost. And so Slim was able to swoop in and buy many of them for 1 or 2% of their book value. And here's what Slim had to say about it. The year 1983 was crazy. These were the best times ever. Nobody wanted to buy anything and everyone wanted to sell. He bought a paper company with a huge facility for just he bought a paper company which had this huge factory for just $1.5 million. He shut it down and over the years redeveloped the site into an upscale shopping centre and this free public art museum that sits today on some of the most valuable real estate in Mexico City. He bought the Mexican operations of Walgreens, Denny's, Hershey's, Sears, Firestone, British American Tobacco. He bought a mining company for $50 million and by 2011 that company was valued at just under $12 billion. So this was very much the strategy of buy when there's blood in the streets, and Slim did really well out of it. By 1989, Slim was already one of Mexico's most successful industrialists. But it's what came next that would catapult him not just to the top spot in Mexico, but in the world. And it started with Telmex, the state-owned phone monopoly. So again, for context, by the late 80s, Telmex was a disaster. 8 out of 10 Mexican households had no phone line at all. The waiting list to get a phone line was over 2.5 years. The maintenance fleet was 20 to 25 years old, with most of the vehicles spending more time in the garage than on the road. A 7-minute call to the US back then cost $10. That's just under $30 in today's money. So in 1988, the government decided to privatise Telmex. Now, while Slim had the money and the political connections, he didn't have the technical know-how to run a modern phone network, so he built a team. He brought in Southwestern Bell from the US for the technical side of the business, France Telecom for the network infrastructure, and together, Slim's consortium bid $1.76 billion for a controlling stake in the business. There were other serious rivals in the auction, but Slim's group won by a slim margin of just 4.1%. And crucially, as part of the deal, Slim's consortium was handed a 6-year monopoly, which meant no competitor could legally offer the same service and Slim could set whatever price he wanted. Now, people have argued that he was handed a sweetheart deal because he was close to the president, and it is worth looking into this. The president at that time, Carlos Salinas, he has a lot of skeletons. I mean, for example, his brother, who worked as a civil servant, was later found to have a Swiss bank account with $144 million in it. Federal witnesses testified that while Salinas was president, his administration provided high-level protection to the Gulf drug cartel. And Slim, together with 24 other industrialists, admitted to giving Salinas $25 million each, supposedly to fund independent financing of elections. I mean, dodgy to say the least. Now, Slim's defenders will point out that the Telmex auction was a blind, competitive, sealed bid process, that there was serious competition, that he won by just 4.1%, a very narrow margin, and that he paid a 16% premium over Telmex's market value at that time. His defenders will also say that the reason he needed that 6-year monopoly was justified because the company was in dire straits and it required a lot of investment. And there is some truth to that. I mean, there was a $16 billion pension deficit, so Slim had to divert about $20 billion from operating revenue over the following years just to cover it. On top of that, his consortium spent more than $32 billion modernising the network. There were also 7,000 telephone operators whose jobs had effectively been made redundant by the introduction of direct dialing, and under the terms of the deal, Slim had to agree not to fire anyone. And Slim defenders will argue that the restructuring did work. By 1993, the waiting list for phone lines was gone, and revenue climbed from $3.8 billion at privatisation to $7.9 billion. But where the deal does seem to tip into a sweetheart type arrangement and becomes, I think, very difficult to defend is when we look at the total lack of any independent oversight. Because no serious regulator was set up to keep the company in check, so there was nothing stopping Slim from hiking the rates. And he did, to such an extent that comprehensive research shows that Telmex was overcharging Mexican customers by an estimated $13.4 billion a year. Now, in 1997, Telmex's monopoly period ended and competitors flooded in, but Slim fought it really, really hard because Telmex still controlled all the local infrastructure, the actual copper lines running into all the homes in Mexico, what's known in the industry as the last mile. And Slim charged his rivals enormous fees just to use those lines. Effectively, he choked off most competition before it could even get started. And so, under pressure from its North American Free Trade Agreement partners, who were furious about the monopoly, Mexico did eventually create a telecom regulator, but it gave it a tiny budget and no real power. And whenever it tried to enforce the rules, Slim's legal team, which was the largest, most highly paid corporate army in Latin America, they filed injunctions. And with Mexico's courts notoriously slow, each injunction brought years of delay. And the moment one issue got resolved, Telmex fired another injunction. And a former Telmex lawyer, who was pretty upfront about it, said the following: "We obtained more than 200 injunctions. We created an incredible legal and procedural mess." And Slim's team, they went even beyond injunctions. Here's a quote from a rival: "I know of at least 2 executives who had to leave the country for a while to avoid an arrest warrant that Telmex got from a judge. They've created a culture of fear that has paralysed the industry." And you see, the problem with this, as well as just overcharging customers, preventing any real competition from getting into the market, all of this was also happening at a time when the internet was transforming economies everywhere, and telecom companies around the world were investing heavily in upgrades to meet this demand, but not in Mexico. Telmex kept its customers on slow, aging copper line connections while charging premium prices, and customers didn't have a choice because there was nowhere else to go. And this had a devastating impact on Mexico's overall development. Throughout the 2000s, Mexico ranked last or second to last among OECD member states for broadband speed, and it took until 2013 for the government to force Telmex to open its networks to rivals for free, and only then did Mexican internet speeds start catching up with the rest of the world. Anyway, I'm jumping ahead a bit. So, while the fixed line telephone business laid the foundation to Slim's massive wealth, it was mobiles that really catapulted him into the big time. Slim's mobile operation was called Telcel, and it was launched as Mexico's first mobile network back in 1989. But by the mid-90s, growth had completely stalled, and the reason was simple. Telcel was copying the mobile business models of Western carriers in developed countries, which was as follows. Western carriers gave away phones in exchange for locking customers into long-term contracts. But that contract was also the reason these phones could only ever be sold in outlets where staff had to be trained up, because signing someone up meant a credit check, a bank account for billing, and a trained representative to process all that paperwork. And of course, it worked on the basis that every customer had recurring income and a bank account. However, in Mexico, roughly half the population had no steady income or bank account at this time. They couldn't pass a credit check, let alone, commit to a monthly bill. So getting ordinary people onto mobile phones in Mexico meant rethinking the entire model. So Slim devised what he called the Amigo system. He sold handsets at a loss through corner shops and supermarkets, pre-boxed, ready to go, and made his money on prepaid cards instead. No contract, no credit check, no bank account, so you didn't need to train up staff to sell it. And for the customer, if you had cash that week, you bought a card. If you didn't, the phone still received calls for free. So corner shops all over the country were involved in selling this service. His foreign partners thought this idea was financial suicide, but it worked. Within a few years, 90% of his customers were on the Amigo plan, and that model became the blueprint that operators across Africa, India and China copied to bring mobile phones to billions of people. Now in early 2001, America Mobile, that was his parent mobile company, it listed on the New York Stock Exchange at a $15 billion valuation. Slim still held about 35% of the company and controlled over 50% of the voting power. And he used the money from this to start buying up undercapitalized mobile operators across Latin America. By 2007, America Mobile was operating in 18 countries with over 300 million customers and $28 billion in revenue. And while all this was happening, Slim kept making money from very, very smart investments. One of the sharpest was Apple. In 1997, when the company was at its weakest, Slim invested $60 million. Months later, Steve Jobs returned as CEO, launched the iMac, launched the iPod, the stock took off, and when Slim eventually cashed out, he's estimated to have made about $300 million profit. Another example, in 2002, during WorldCom's fraud bankruptcy, which is a great story involving Bernie Ebbers, and I'll definitely be covering this at some time, Slim bought distressed bonds at 10 to 20 cents on the dollar. 3 years later, he cashed out, making a profit of $584 million. Now, we don't know exactly why Slim makes these individual investments, other than, as I mentioned earlier, he's a numbers guy. He could see things where others couldn't. The numbers have to make sense. As he said himself, I invest for the long term, not the short term. If you buy something because it's cheap, that's only speculation. Now, like most people, when I was growing up, I hadn't really come across Carlos Slim. That was, of course, until 8th of August 2007, because that was the day that Fortune magazine named him the world's richest man with a $60 billion fortune, overtaking Bill Gates. And suddenly we are all finding out about this guy who owned 200 companies, accounted for 40% of Mexico's entire stock exchange. So after this Fortune magazine came out, then there was loads of profile pieces of him in all the major publications, and the New York Times gave a great figure that give you an indication of how Slim dominated the Mexican economy at that time. Slim's wealth and footprint in Mexico was the equivalent of Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, and the 6 other largest industrialists of the Gilded Age combined. And while plenty of Mexicans were really proud of Slim's achievement, proof of what their country could produce, the criticism was also pretty fierce, because they were pointing out that Slim had built the vast majority of his fortune in telecoms, and yet ordinary Mexicans were paying some of the highest phone bills in the developed world. They were stuck with some of the worst and slowest internet infrastructure anywhere, all in a country where roughly half the population lived below the poverty line. And the criticism, it did have an impact, because right as the global press was crowning him the world's richest man, Slim committed $6 billion to his charitable foundations. But he also has his own take on charities. Slim doesn't believe that straight up charity will solve poverty. In his own words, I don't believe in charities too much. They can make you popular, but you don't solve any problems. Poverty is eliminated by creating jobs, not by doing charity. So his foundations built their own programs, digital training, basic healthcare, trade courses, and all run with the same discipline as his businesses. So when I'm looking at this sprawling 200 company empire, the obvious question for me is, how does he actually run it? What is he like to work with? So Slim has a set of 10 operating principles that he runs everything by. Many of them he inherited from his father, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but one of them is to keep structures simple. So to Slim, this means killing corporate bureaucracy before it kills the business. No layers of middle management, no endless committees or meetings, none of the corporate fat that slows a company down. Another principle he lives by is to maintain austerity in good times. And he definitely lives by this rule. He works out of a windowless 2-story office that his staff called the bunker, with just 2 secretaries, and the office is littered with paperwork. He doesn't use a computer. He wears off-the-rack suits from Sears. He wears a plastic wristwatch that doubles as a calculator. He lives in a house with 6 bedrooms and a modest swimming pool. Although the contradiction here is that within the house there are Van Goghs, Renoirs and Rodin sculptures. Apparently Slim is the world's largest private collector of Rodin. Is it Rodin or Rodin? I'm not too sure. Anyway, in terms of working with Slim, in meetings he can be impatient. He expects his executives to memorize all of the key numbers, and when presented with accounts, he's known for spotting even the smallest error in a sub-column within seconds. On the flip side, he's extremely loyal. Executives who buy into his philosophy, they rarely leave, and he doesn't fire people for making mistakes. Here's a quote from someone who knows him well. He's the only one of the big tycoons who does not behave obnoxiously. He's quiet, not ostentatious. He's a hands-on manager, a worker. And then in terms of strategy, a prominent Mexican economist said the following of Slim. I think Slim is a world-class strategist and business developer, the shrewdest of anything we know in Mexico. And one of the strategies that Slim became most noted for was one he borrowed from his hero, Genghis Khan. Now, just to be clear, he isn't an admirer of Genghis Khan's brutality, but the strategy he's notorious for copying is Genghis Khan's retreat strategy. So in battle, Genghis Khan's cavalry would appear to panic and flee, drawing the enemy out of formation and straight into an ambush. Around 2004, Slim did something similar. He announced that he was formally stepping back from day-to-day running of his companies, handing operational control to his sons and his son-in-law. The markets and other Mexican business people assumed that Slim, who at this stage was 64, was winding down. But he blindsided them by moving into and dominating new sectors like major infrastructure contracts, deep water oil and gas, geothermal energy. Anyway, getting back to 2007, he's become the richest man. Then we have the 2008 financial crisis. And, while Slim's fortune dropped like almost everyone else's, it didn't slow him down. And what I think is his most intriguing investment happened in the middle of the financial crisis. And this was his investment in the New York Times. And again, I'll definitely be doing a story on the New York Times, maybe a 2 or 3 parter, because I find it such an interesting business. So for context, by 2008, the paper was in serious trouble. Print advertising was collapsing, $400 million in debt was coming due, and an aggressive hedge fund had built up nearly a 20% stake, and they were demanding cost cuts, layoffs, asset sales. The Sulzberger family, who'd owned and run the paper since 1896, they needed a white knight, and they got 2. The first was David Geffen, the Hollywood mogul. Again, fascinating character, going to do a story on him. So his plan was kind of noble, really. He wanted to buy the paper, take it private, eventually turn it into a non-profit. But the Sulzbergers, they were worried that an American owner with strong political views would try to shape the paper's editorial direction. The second white knight was Slim, and the Sulzberger family preferred him because Slim couldn't have cared less about American politics or culture wars. To him, the Times was simply a distressed asset with a world-class brand, and like all of his investments, he was just looking at the numbers. So he agreed to loan them $250 million at a 14% interest rate. And as part of the deal, he also had warrants that gave him the right to buy 16 million shares at $6.35. To pay him back, the Times had to sell its headquarters, its stake in the Boston Red Sox, the Boston Globe newspaper, which they'd bought for $1.1 billion in 1993, and they had to sell it in 2013 for just $70 million. But it worked. The Times paid back Slim in full, and he walked away with $90 million in interest from his $250 million loan. But far more impressively, in 2015, he exercised those warrants, and when he eventually sold them in 2020, he made a profit of $414 million. And that lifeline he gave them, it did more than save the paper. It bought the Times enough breathing room to bet everything on the digital subscription model that is really the envy of most traditional media, because today the New York Times has 13 million digital subscribers, zero debt, and an annual revenue of $2.8 billion with healthy profits. Anyway, back to Mexico. We're into 2013 and the politics are now changing because a new government has come in and finally they launch a proper independent telecoms regulator with real teeth this time. So América Móvil, Slim's company, was declared a dominant player. Competitors got free access to Slim's network. But, while there is competition in the sector now, his businesses are still minting it. América Móvil is pulling in $52 billion a year with quarterly profits of over $1 billion, and he still controls 60 to 70% of all mobile lines in Mexico. He also expanded into Europe in 2014 when he bought a controlling stake in Telekom Austria, and the deal also allowed him to open up into markets in Central and Eastern Europe with close to 30 million customers now. So today, Slim is 85, worth $120 billion, and three of his sons and his son-in-law, they run the day-to-day businesses. But Slim remains the strategic brain behind it all. As he said himself, "My job is to think. This is my work. This is what makes my life sense, what motivates me to get up. If they take this away from me, I would feel dead." His businesses now include telecoms, banking, construction, retail, energy, financial services, mining, real estate. The joke in Mexico is that a large percentage of the population live in a house built by Slim, drive on a highway paved by Slim, make a call on a network run by Slim, shop in a centre developed by Slim, eat lunch at a restaurant owned by Slim, and pay for it with a credit card issued by Slim. I was talking to my brother recently about how certain business people just seem to be able to make money in any sector they turn their hand to. Most of us would be happy to build one successful business in a lifetime. Slim has built dozens across completely different sectors. That's a pretty amazing feat. And his superpower is this amazing grasp of numbers. This is a guy who doesn't use a computer. He tracks his global empire manually with pens, paper, notebooks, and mental arithmetic. And when asked why he doesn't use a computer, and I love this, he said, "A computer tells you what is. Your brain tells you what could be." Now, for all the criticism, that's directed at Slim, and some of it is entirely justified, he will defend his record by pointing to the jobs he created, the tens of thousands of people employed across his businesses, because Slim believes that employment is the foundation of a healthy society. And of course, there's a lot of truth in that. But on the flip side, if you're one of the world's richest men who made his fortune in a very, very poor country, and the evidence shows you overcharged your fellow citizens by an estimated $13.4 billion a year, and that by not investing in the infrastructure that you owned, as evidenced by Mexico's terrible internet service right up until 2013, then you actively held back your country's development. So the criticism of Slim is fair. When your business is vital to national infrastructure, I think you carry a different kind of responsibility. It can't just be all about profits. You can't say the government should have put better checks in place and leave it at that. Slim proclaims himself to be a proud Mexican, and he of all people lives by facts and figures. And the facts and figures say that while he created enormous wealth and employment, he also held the country back. But at the same time, on a human level, Slim comes across as this very down-to-earth guy whose entire being is just about building things. He can be gruff, yes, but also humble, loyal to the people around him, and for the most part, completely uninterested in the trappings of wealth. And those are qualities that I really admire. But I'll give the last word to his Mexican biographer, who probably said it best. "This is not the story of a hero or a villain, but of a human being with a mountain of contradictions. For some sectors of Mexican society, Slim is an aspirational figure. For another sector, he incarnates the enormous inequality of this country. And whatever your thoughts on Slim, he makes for a fascinating story. And that brings us to listeners' emails. And this one comes from Johan, who'd love me to do a story on Mark Rich. And I definitely will be covering Mark Rich because he was one of the biggest commodity traders in the 70s and 80s. And the stories around him are incredible. Thanks so much for the suggestion, Johan, and for listening. And remember, if you have any comments, any corrections, or any story you'd like me to cover, email me at info@gbspod.com. All the best, folks.